Welcome. We'll get started in a few minutes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We'll get started in a minute. We see some new folks are logging on, so we'll let people get connected and then we'll get started. For those of you who are present, could you type in your name, what country you're in right now, and let us know if you're mentoring someone? That would be great.
Stereotype and unfair and untrue belief that people for
standardized mental picture. Pueden predecir el comportamiento de una persona basada en su raza o nivel social. Estereotipo.
You'll see a few folks coming in. Yes, if you would please introduce yourself in the chat. It also helps us keep record of who's attending, and when we're reporting back to our funders, we oh, you are seeing presenter view. Thank you, Argida. Are you still seeing presenter's view? Yep. All right. Weird. Better?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Maybe they're not afraid, but they're on notice. In a way, it's like,
So see some people logging in still, then we'll get started. But if you would, your name, institution, country, a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself in the chat. Again, this helps us understand who's coming so we can better serve you in the future with our programming. And then we're going to get started in a minute. Thank you. Hi, Brent. Nice to see you. Hello, Mulu Work. Glad you're here. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Many of you have attended our previous sessions, and we're so grateful to have you back today for our third session of the Tuberculosis Research Advancement Center's Mentor Training Series. As you know, we have a number of different topics planned for you. Hang on one second. I'm going to switch my own view here. And today we've had foundations of mentoring, we've had a setting expectations sessions, and we are going to put these recordings up on our YouTube channel. So if you didn't make those, you're able to watch the recordings. Today, we're talking a little bit about some data we have with our US mentors. I'm going to mention more about that in a minute. And as you can see, we have another session in September on communication, another one in October on mentoring in different contexts, and then we're planning one for November with our date still forthcoming on how to build mentoring programs more at an institutional level. So thank you all for being here this morning, this afternoon, and this evening, depending on where you're logging in from. Today, it's a little bit more of a presentation style session. The other two have been a little more of a skill building, but I do have some interactive elements for today. So we hope that you will get involved with the chat in the polls as we get going today. Okay, first poll today, of course, as you're introducing yourselves, if you would, remind us and tell us who's in the room today. What country are you living in? Go ahead and take a second to answer that. Ooh, I see Georgia's coming out ahead right now. Some from Ethiopia. Let's see, who else? United States, Philippines, great. All right, so some real diverse locations. There's a few more of you who could respond. I'll give you another minute so you can see who is in the room here. And this is really relevant for what we're talking about today, because we are talking about mentoring across different countries and cultures. And so it's wonderful that we have people from different locations with us today for this session. I'll give you another second to respond. I'm going to show you the results here. So you can see we have primarily Ethiopia, Georgia, one from the Philippines. So glad you're here. Tell your peers and colleagues, maybe they can join us next time, and also several from the United States. So what I'm going to share today is just some broad definitions of cross-cultural mentoring, and then some highlights from some of the interviews we've done with mentors in the United States who are mentoring across different countries. I also just want to say, oh, Laurel, did you hit record?
Yep.
Okay, great. I didn't hear it. Usually it announces it, so I just wanted to make sure we were good to go.
No, we're good.
All right. So cross-cultural mentoring is a lifelong journey. I really believe in a cultural humility perspective here, which asks us to always think about who we are and reflect on our own positionality, as well as having this commitment to really thinking about our work over time. And so we don't always have the answers. We're always in a process of learning and being flexible and adaptation. And so in the time we have today, I am really just hitting a few topics, but there's so much more for us to discuss. So I really wanted to mention that this is a few details about this process that we have, but it's a much bigger topic. And I encourage everyone to continue to explore this. Cross-cultural mentoring, one way to define it is involving an ongoing or intentional and mutually enriching relationship with someone who's of a different race, gender, ethnicity, religion, cultural background, sexual identity, sexual orientation, and nationality. So any sort of kind of mentoring across difference is how I think about it. This can occur within our own institutions. So those of you who are on this call, these things we talk about today, although they're coming from mentoring across countries, are really relevant for the mentoring we do within our own institutions and our own countries too. Of course, because we're so international, even within our own countries, that often we are mentoring folks who come from different backgrounds than our own. And that's very important for us to have a diverse workforce, right? Because a diverse scientific workforce is going to allow us to address complex problems more comprehensively. And so that's really our goal here, is to make sure we have scientists from different backgrounds and expertise that are supported and excelling at their research, right? Especially in TB, so that we can really address the complexity of TB and other health concerns. Betty Kutcher, who has come up with this definition or published this definition of cross-cultural mentoring, which is referenced a lot in literature, really identifies considering what she calls the 3 V's, our values. So identifying and recognizing our values across cultures. Who are we individually or collectively? What values do we bring to the relationship in terms of science, our scientific pathways, our career pathways? Our virtues, so what attitudes, dispositions, or character traits do we have that enable us to really support mentees or trainees as mentors? How do we bring that into the relationship and address it? And make sure that's not a barrier to us providing good mentoring relationships. The third V is vision, holding some sort of collective vision of inclusive environment, meaning how do we think about science on a more national, international level, or our profession or our overall knowledge base in a way that allows us to integrate different research approaches, different cultural backgrounds, different types of training. So we have, again, diverse perspectives to our science to move forward our understanding of TB, and then the ability to implement programs that are also relevant to different cultural backgrounds, different groups, different populations in different countries. I also want to pull forward the definition of culturally aware mentoring. This is really coming from CIMR, which is a Center for Mentoring here in the United States, also known as the National Research Mentoring Network. And this is part of our lifelong journey and process as we're talking through these data to keep this in mind, that they define culturally aware mentoring as mentoring practices in which mentors recognize our own culturally shaped beliefs, our perceptions, and our judgments, and that we really remain cognizant of cultural differences and how they can become strengths to research and to our practices and our career pathways. And understanding how this might be important in the mentoring relationship between mentors and mentees. Sorry. I also want to mention that when we're talking about cross-cultural mentoring, often we are kind of balancing this perspective we have of the individual as well as this larger context and meaning of either the country they're in or the country we're in. And I just kind of show this big picture to remind ourselves that often in our cases in the programs I'm working with, we have two mentors aligned with an individual mentee, an international mentor and an in-country mentor. And we're kind of working at an individual level to support this trainee in their research career. And at the same time, we're balancing what is the larger context that we're all working in. And so I think that's one of the skills involved with cross-cultural mentoring is that mentors must really maintain this dual perspective of seeing the mentee as an individual, but also always thinking about what are we working in terms of a larger context, right? And that really is culture, right? It's the culture of the countries we live in. It's the culture of the science we work in. It's the culture of the communities we're in within our own countries. And this culture can manifest itself in some very visible ways, but also invisible ways. And when we're mentoring across distance, sometimes that's really hard to discern is what is culture, what is my behavior, what is their behavior, and how can we really address any challenges or barriers to make sure we're mentoring in the best ways possible, right? There's some literature that really talks about mentoring cross-culturally, again, within our own countries or across countries, requires an ethos of care, like really understanding and being committed, right, to the fact that sometimes mentoring across difference takes more time and more commitment to be effective. Some folks also say that when we're thinking about mentoring cross-culturally, we need to address the sharing of power and information and also ourselves to have effective relationships. Okay. So I'm going to pause right now and I'm going to ask you from the polls, are you currently in a mentoring relationship with somebody who is in a country outside of your own? And for some reason wait, let me go back. Okay, so you should see this in front of you right now. If you have a moment, if you could let me know, are you currently in a mentoring relationship with someone in another country, either as a mentor or as a mentee? Okay, it looks like about 70% of you are saying yes, you are in some sort of mentoring relationship, either as a mentor or a mentee. Internationally, and some of you are not. Okay, so I'll give you another minute to respond and I'll share those results back with you. But for those of you who are answering no, again, because we have so much international collaboration and exchange between our research teams or research groups, these tips should help you with people you're working with in your own country as well. So I'll just let you see those results. It looks like 61% of you are currently in a relationship with somebody in another country. Also, for those of you who said no, I hope that you will experience this type of mentorship at some point soon in your career. Okay, let's keep going. Thank you for all your introductions, by the way, in the chat. If you're newly joining us, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat so that we know who you are, your name and your country and your institution. And at any time, please also ask any questions in the chat, and I'll pause and get to those when I can. You're also welcome to unmute and interrupt me at any point in time. So what I'd like to do next is share with you some qualitative evaluation findings that we have from interviews with our U.S. mentors across 3 different Fogarty programs, which of course are research training programs, building research capacity, 2 of these explicitly with TB researchers and 1 across multiple different disease areas, including some who are focused on TB. And as I mentioned, these data come from programs where the trainees are aligned with an in-country or a local mentor, as well as an international mentor. And they are they're completing some training in research, as well as a mentored research project over the course of 2 years, which aims to have them submit a peer-reviewed publication or complete a peer-reviewed publication by the end of their time, and a grant proposal to really prepare them for a career as an independent investigator, particularly in TB or some other disease areas in conjunction with TB. So these data come from our interviews with U.S. mentors as a complement to our previous published data that we've done already with our Fogarty in-country mentors and mentees from Ethiopia and Georgia. And I'm actually going to add that paper to the chat so that you can have that. So that's this paper I'm sending you is the actual data from the folks in Ethiopia and Georgia. And again, these data are complementary to that, understanding more from the US perspective as the mentors, as part of those mentoring teams. So we have findings in a couple of different areas. And I'm so sorry, I'm just going to stop sharing my slides for 1 minute and make sure I have the right slides up here. Yes, okay. Okay, sorry. Okay, let me reshare. And while I'm doing this, please let me know if you have any questions so far. Okay, great. All right, let me see. I see you are still seeing the other views. Let me change that. Hang on. For some reason, I'm having Zoom challenges today. Everybody, thank you for hanging on there. I'm trying to change you to presenter view. I'm not sure why I'm having challenges right now with Zoom. For some reason, it's just not showing me on my screen that I'm sharing, even though I know that I am sharing with you all. So I'm just going to try one more time to have this share the screen. I'm sorry for this interruption. Okay, here we go again. Let's try this one more time. I'm so sorry, y'all. I don't know what is happening with my Zoom over here where I am not able to see everything that I'm doing here. Hang on, let me try one more time here. Third time's going to be a charm. Okay, here we go. Let's try this again. All right, I think we're going to go from here and make this work. Okay, and are you seeing presenter view right now, or are you seeing the full screens? Can someone tell me?
Both.
You're seeing what? The full screen?
Both screens.
Presenter.
You're seeing presenter. Okay.
Interview.
Okay, thank you. All right, here we go. Let's try this again. All right, so I'm going to share some thematic findings from our interviews with U.S. mentors about their experiences mentoring trainees in Georgia and Ethiopia. They started in these interviews by really sharing their roles and what they covered and kind of the content of their mentoring. So primarily, they really were focused on translating their research projects and proposals into actual practice and implementation, helping trainees defining measures, designing data collection and instruments, troubleshooting problems, reviewing their specific aims, making sure they're feasible, they're straightforward, and they're clear, and they're doable. Then kind of down the line, helping them think about what grants they might be able to apply for as they move forward with their research, thinking about how their research in the program can launch them into larger and additional funding opportunities, helping them identify those grants, discussing those future plans. Also helping trainees review their manuscripts for peer-reviewed publications, making sure they're disseminating their science. And that dissemination included helping review their abstracts and slides for conferences, and then also thinking about kind of larger career plans. There were a lot of challenges that came up that I want to share, and then I'm going to first share the challenges, and then I'm going to go into how to overcome some of these challenges. First of all, communication is a real thing with distance mentoring, whether you're in the United States or across country, but inconsistent access or quality of internet can really interrupt regular meetings, and even phone service can be challenging at times. They also reported that the time difference can be difficult in terms of managing meetings. It can cause some gaps in communication. Many of them actually started mentoring without having visited Ethiopia or Georgia first, but were able to later on in the mentoring relationship. And since those meetings were rarely in person, it's a big adjustment if you're used to meeting with your mentees in person to translate that all to online and how to have that same skill set and that same success online. So that was something that came up. And again, I'll provide some ideas on how to get around or work around those things in a minute. Other challenges related to communication is establishing regular meetings with mentees. Again, time differences, different calendar systems, long periods of time between meetings would make it very difficult to kind of pick up and have momentum with mentorship and research projects. And also, I think some different ideas in terms of having those meetings in a model that's in mentoring, where a mentee really initiates a lot of the management of mentorship versus supervision, which is often the model happening in other countries where it's more top-down, where the mentor initiates meetings. So some differences around who actually schedules and mentors meetings. You can see some quotes from the US mentors right here. One saying, "We've tried to set up regular meetings, but the biggest obstacle is just kind of time and motivation if you're not seeing each other regularly and having this personal contact." Another mentor really noted those cultural differences, where in some countries, the initiation, again, would only come from a mentor, and to reach out to a mentor would almost seem insulting or disrespectful. And so when you have mentoring teams across countries, really trying to understand who initiates these meetings and who manages these meetings and making sure that they're happening. And you can read along the quotes as I talk through this presentation. The other challenge is feedback. I think this makes sense given that mentoring involves so much written communication, and we're often mentoring on writing, right? And things that are most likely required to be in English, as still the majority of our scientific journals are often published in English. And so feedback is occurring over email, often through track changes, which sometimes that in of itself is a new concept to mentees working through track changes and not just written feedback. Mentors reported that it was difficult to know how feedback is received because it is often done over email, and that sometimes there was a lack of follow-up after feedback, so it was hard to tell if their feedback was helpful or integrated into their work. And that even trainees with strong English language skills, the nuances of feedback and of the English language are often sometimes hard to understand. And so mentors were sometimes left questioning, did my comments make sense? Were they interpreted the way I intended them to be by the actual trainee? And so I like this quote that says from one mentor, I think particularly with writing, then you get into this very blurred line of scientific / interpretation differences, or is it just a language barrier? So because of the difference in language, sometimes it was hard for mentors to know, do they disagree with me, or are we just understanding the words we're using differently, right? So that could be a real challenge with feedback. And then another quote here from a mentor that says, there are a few things where I've made comments on something, and it will appear later that the mentee didn't quite understand the comment because he won't have addressed it the way I've wanted him to, right? So I'll just reflag it and try to reframe it in a different way, but I don't know if that's necessarily cross-cultural or whether the same thing would happen in the English language or an English speaking mentee. So again, a lot of questions around or unknowns around how feedback is being delivered, whether it's effective, and how that's being interpreted by trainees. Another area of challenge that was addressed in these interviews is really mentors from the US saying that there were some areas they really felt ill-equipped to provide some guidance or uncertain about providing guidance. In the United States, they were really aware of these things like career paths and opportunities, the IRB process or ethics committees, promotion processes, the grants and funding available to US scholars. But in another country, they were less certain about some of these things. They could offer their perspective, but they did really rely on local mentors to have more knowledge about these areas of mentorship. For example, one mentor said, I don't really know all the opportunities. For example, what are the best FOAs and PAs for them to pursue? What actual practical and what's realistic? I don't know. I just, from the limited interaction I've had, I don't really know what the day-to-day is like or what the mentee has time for. Another mentor saying, if you're not there, it's hard to know what the system is, having never visited before. And one mentor saying that they just were unfamiliar whether international trainees could receive NIH grant funding and wanting to know and needing to know more about that through this mentorship. And here's another quote from a mentor that said that they've not visited the institution or have been, this is Addis particularly, and that they don't have a sense of the clinical environment or the research infrastructure. And so at times it's really difficult to give guidance with some uncertainty around what's actually doable in a clinical research environment in another country. Sometimes mentors express that they often provided more technical assistance than they did to their mentees in the United States, mentioning things like statistical software where training might be not available in the countries in which the trainees are located, but perhaps more available in the United States. And so some of the mentorship moved away from sort of professional development or even larger research concepts and guidance on that to more specific technical skills to reduce that as a barrier to moving forward on their research. And you can see this quote here, as one mentor said, it's more technical assistance than really career or professional mentorship. And then to mention just briefly, we, of course, these data come from a program where there's mentoring teams. And so kind of challenges with mentoring, connecting the co-mentors. And I think this is an area we're really working on in our program, is really allowing an opportunity for the mentors in country and internationally to meet with each other and share their own science. And the US mentors did mention some concern that without the knowledge for some of the local systems, they felt like some of the mentoring in this team really required the mentor in country to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So you can see this quote here that says, if the US mentor isn't really persistent about keeping up the relationship, communication may fall apart. So feeling that that was on them, that was really important as the US mentor. But if that happens, then the Ethiopian mentor or any other international or in-country mentor may take on a lot of the responsibility, and this mentor particularly saying having concerns about that. So I'm going to move into some solutions for some of these areas we mentioned, but please, I'm going to pause for a minute and feel free to add any questions that you have to the chat. Okay, so some tips on how to address this and some things we've tried to put into action in some of these programs. So I started this presentation by talking about the balance between understanding the larger context in which you're mentoring as well as the individual, always kind of having those two things in mind. How am I supporting the individual in the perspective of this larger context of cross-cultural or cross-country or distance mentoring? So this sounds easy, but first thing, try to learn some key words in your mentee or trainee's language. Hello, goodbye, maybe some research terms, but spend some time understanding some local language and a little bit more, or as part of learning a little bit about their culture. The other thing is recognizing in-country holidays. So often we are communicating by email, being thoughtful about when they are away or out of their office on holidays, wishing them well on their holidays, and just a visible recognition that we are working in a multicultural setting here, even if it's over Zoom or by email. Also, to understand larger context, one thing you can do as a mentor is really understand, are there scientific journals publishing important research in their own country? We tend to rely on our top tier journals here that are published from the United States, even if they have an international focus. But are there ways you can understand local developments about research in their own country and be aware of those, even if it's just reading some abstracts and titles of what's being published and being aware of the names of those journals and who perhaps are even editing those journals. I know in our case, many of our mentors are the editors of those journals, so being aware of local research is really helpful for context. Also, if you have time, ask the mentees, what do they log into as their news source? How do they learn about their field? How do they learn about what's going on in the world? And then perhaps take some time to look at those sources yourself. So again, you understand this bigger picture of the context of the country, of the profession, and what's going on. And then in your meetings, I'm going to mention this actually a few more times as we go through this, trying to save a few minutes at the beginning or end of your meetings to the get to know you conversation. So tell me a little bit about your day. Tell me about what's going on in your department. Tell me about what's going on in your clinic, your family, but anything that allows you to get to know mentees a little bit more personally. In a way, you might have a hallway conversation here in the United States with your mentee. And by the way, this last bullet point comes from our qualitative data with international trainees saying, I really want my mentor to know more about me as a whole human being and the context in which I work. So these bullet points here do come from our data with qualitative interviews and focus groups with people in country. In terms of communication, this is a real challenge, and it will change as we become better and better at having virtual technologies. Clearly, COVID taught us some new things about how to communicate through Zoom and other mechanisms. But really, I think we expect in the United States, everyone to use Microsoft Outlook, if that's the way that we manage our lives, which I know I do. It's not on my calendar, it doesn't exist. And what I've run across many different international training programs in different countries that have different calendar systems. And so have a conversation about what technology people are using to actually schedule their meetings and what communication works best to have your meetings. Is it Zoom? Is it a phone call? Is it, for example, I've used Google Hangouts recently with some calls in Ethiopia, and it's worked so well. I think probably better than Zoom. That's not my go-to technology, but my colleague brought that forward and it was a great idea. So discuss this strategy openly, what works best. Don't assume the one we're using here in the US is best. Also, WhatsApp is really helpful for reminders or short texts or emails. Rather than an email system, just some quick contact. So discuss that as a possibility. And then in a previous session, I think it was last week, we talked about RAN, reminders, agenda, and notes for meeting management. Review that, because that's one way to really help communication stay on track between meetings. I'm not going to go into that in detail right now. Also, one suggestion is with your communication is to send those invites for meetings once you decide on your calendar system, send for several months and get them on the calendar. So I'm actually going to shoot a poll off right now to find out. I'm curious from all of you. Right now, for all of you on this call, what calendar system do you use first? And then I'm going to ask you another question. Let's see. And I know there's others out there, by the way. So if you are an other, go ahead and click that and put it in the chat. So interesting. So some people still using the old-fashioned notebook, which I know happens. Some using Google, about half and half Google, half and half, or half Outlook. More with Google right now. Okay, great. So even that, with just this consensus in this group, shows us that there's more than one ways to schedule on calendars. And sometimes these invites don't always sync. So that is worth a conversation in one of your meetings with your mentors and mentees. And then I'm curious, wait. I'm going to ask you now, talking about our meetings and regular meetings, do you currently, for those of you in the room who are mentoring, have regular mentorship meetings scheduled on your calendar for at least 3 months in advance? Looks like most of you are saying yes. Some of you no. I'll just give you a second to respond. So most of you, great, good. So this is an excellent practice, I think, getting these meetings on the calendar, making sure they're showing up on people's calendars for many months in advance is really helpful to making sure your communication stays strong. All right, so about 70% of you say yes, that's excellent. All right, the other thing you can do to help improve your communication is really have a policy of not canceling due to slow time in the research project. What I've heard from mentees, international trainees and mentees, is that they will fear wasting their mentor's time if they don't have a real pressing or urgent matter. What I recommend is that you communicate that this is a time to reflect on what they've done and think about future plans, and perhaps have some larger conversations about professional development. So as mentors, I think it's important for you to communicate to your trainees, don't cancel a meeting if you don't have anything that's urgent. Let's at least check in and find out what's going on. Oftentimes, I think the mentors are more aware of what needs to be discussed. Sometimes trainees haven't gotten there. Sometimes they don't know what they don't know, right? This is just one of the reasons why they're a trainee. And mentors can help guide them through this process of really understanding what's important to talk about. So keep those meetings as much as you can. The other thing is, in these meetings, you might want to stop more frequently and summarize what's being said than in meetings you're having with people in which you're sharing a culture or language, right? So thinking about stopping more regularly throughout those meetings and making sure you're understanding each other. And the other thing I encourage is thinking about some spontaneous check-ins in between those meetings, sharing an article, asking how their data collection is going, again, wishing them well if it's a holiday. But do think about how in between your meetings, you may be able to have some simple communication that doesn't take a lot of time, but allows you to stay in contact and keep momentum going. And again, if you have any questions about this, please put them into the chat. We mentioned this already when we talked about meetings earlier, that in the US, the tradition is mentees initiate. This is a big cultural shift for some trainees. And so I think being patient and also reminding our trainees over time that if you have a US mentor, US mentors do expect the trainee to initiate those meetings. So really, communicating this over time gently, but also with some accountability and some encouragement would really be helpful if you are a US mentor training or mentoring in a country in which this might be out of tradition due to ideas about respect. Know that when you're starting to meet with international trainees, it does take longer to build trust and rapport. It's just not the same as meeting in person. So allowing patience for this, sharing personal stories about your mentorship, anything you can do in those meetings to share the norms of mentorship as you know them, to be as transparent and clear about that as possible, will allow your mentee to understand what you expect for the content of that relationship. And this idea of virtual tours of your office and your meetings actually comes from our qualitative data with our trainees, where they said, we'd really love to see the environment they're working on. You know, what does their lab look like? What's their team like? What is their day like? And so think about how you might at some point share things with them by some sort of video call, walking around with your laptop. That's what they asked for. Can they walk around with their laptop or their phone and show us their working environment? And perhaps the mentee could do that too. Also, you know, you often as scientists have videos and recordings of your previous presentations and talks. You know, share those with your mentees so they can get to know you in different ways and see you in different capacities. And then another theme that's come up when we've been talking to our trainees is, or if you're thinking about intercultural communication more broadly, is really listening just to listen, not to make a response. I know our role as mentors is to give guidance and advice, but like checking that for a minute and just focusing on what people are saying before, you know, we think we have our anticipated response or guidance. And that's just really helpful to slow things down in meetings and pay attention to nuances and differences in language. Also, this comes from our trainees too. They suggested recording the meetings, because that way, if we are speaking quickly or we cover a lot of topics, it's difficult to take written notes during a meeting. I know I find that difficult myself, even with meetings with people who speak the same language as me in the same culture. You know, allow or encourage them to record the meeting so they can go back and listen to what was discussed, right? In those meetings. And thank you for the enthusiasm about the virtual tour. I really think it brings to life who we are as mentors and scientists. Integrating feedback. I know I hear this as one of the frustrations of mentors all around in the US and internationally, or just a lot of questioning about, you know, am I doing this well? Am I providing feedback well? And how do I make sure they use it? When you're mentoring across country and culture, again, within the United States or across countries, you may need some extra steps planned to really understand how feedback is being used or understood and applied. One way I've talked about with trainees that they've found really helpful, and many of you I'm sure use this when you're submitting feedback for a revise and resubmit for a journal, suggest and provide even a template for your trainees with a table. So if they're receiving feedback from multiple mentors, have them make a table about their research proposal, have them make a table about their manuscript. And in one column, have them insert the comment from mentor 1. This would be the comment from mentor 2. And actually, you could add a column, I'm seeing right here where my mouse is, that says literature review. So it would have the topic in here. And then have the mentee add in there what they're doing to address those comments. That way you have a clear outline of, first of all, are the mentors agreeing on their feedback, or is it different? And you're able to see that across your mentoring team. And also it allows the mentee to be accountable to actually integrating that feedback, or perhaps suggest why they can't integrate that feedback. When I've presented this again to trainees, they've really liked this idea of clarity around, you know, summarizing comments from their mentors and talking about what they're doing to address those comments. And you could do this for a publication, even a PowerPoint presentation, a proposal, whatever it is that you feel like is helpful. Of course, you can do comments and track changes in one document, but something about lifting them all and pulling them up at a higher level on a table changes the perspective about that feedback, and again, has a different accountability in terms of addressing it. Because you're working across cultures, you can ask your mentee to teach back the feedback. So once you give the feedback, ask them to summarize what they feel like it is, how they understand it, and what they might want to do. And then other recommendations we've had from, this is really coming from the US mentors, is having some sort of repository of examples of grants and papers that are good examples, so that when you are providing feedback to your trainees, you can also provide an example of something that is done well, that allows them to learn through observation and example, not just feedback. And of course, that's really helpful when we're considering diverse learning styles. And also you may want to mention, just if this is a language or communication thing, you know, using Grammarly or other support services, that also can be beneficial to your mentees or trainees, asking them what they use and then perhaps providing them other resources. And then in terms of mentoring teams, and I got a great email about this from one of you over the week asking about mentoring teams. And so thank you for that email. And I've thought a bit about it, and I think I'm going to integrate more about mentoring in teams in our session on mentoring in diverse contexts, because we are more and more relying on multiple sources of support to provide guidance on a trainee's career. But in this particular content, some things that came up is a struggle to reach out, or the U.S. mentors not reaching out to in-country mentors, but really liking that idea. And I think the same has been expressed from in-country or local mentors. So initiate contact co-mentors with each other early in the process. If you know you're on a mentoring team, it might be helpful to have a meeting just with the 2 or 3 of you before you actually meet with your mentee. Share your science, share your background, and continually do that throughout the relationship to keep excitement up about your work and sharing your work. Always, you can consider ways of potentially collaborating, not just with the mentee, but with each other on larger projects. And because often people are really mentoring without any sort of compensation, this is one way to incentivize mentoring and make sure that there are benefits to the mentors and these relationships too. So sharing science, trying to build collaboration, and thinking about a relationship between the mentors that is with the mentee, but also in addition to the mentee, maybe something outside. I also want to mention that as U.S. mentors, if you are having questions about the culture of mentoring, this might be a conversation that's easier to have just with the other mentor without the mentee. Because you're at similar rank and your power is at a similar level, you may be able to have more open conversations about differences in mentoring and styles and how to approach mentorship of your mentee together. You know, who can cover what areas of mentorship, how can you work together, what might be some challenges. So I encourage you as mentors on teams to reach out to each other separately, aside from the mentee, in addition to building that relationship with the mentee. And again, these points all come from our interview data. Lastly, I want to wrap up by just sharing some of the rewards that people talked about with mentoring, because overall, I mean, although we're mentioning some of these differences and challenges, overall, the U.S. mentors were so excited about this mentoring experience and found it so rewarding. We're eager to do it and eager to continue it. And here are some quotes that kind of capture some of the sentiments of that experience. So one mentor said, "It's been fun to see the projects the mentees are designing that are so different than the ones my residents in public health mentees do here in the United States." And another says, "Having continued communication with my mentee in Ethiopia is just an amazing opportunity for me." Another says, you, meaning this person as a mentor, feel you're really helping these bright young people who are in an infrastructure that's not always strong, and you're helping them through it. And hopefully in the future, they can take over. And this is really important from the mentors I speak to, this sense of passing along important skills and opportunities to the next generation so they can continue to work on TB research in a way that's really important and, again, address and solve problems. One mentor mentioned a lot of people that I've mentored have actually become part of my research team, and they've been able to, moving my slide, and they've been able to increase the scope of my own work. So that's been really helpful and important. So this mentor's research itself has really grown beyond what they could accomplish on their own. So I think that's really important to remember. And again, goes back to building that relationship between mentors as well as the mentee. Another mentor said, on a personal level, just establishing a relationship and being able to maintain a relationship without having met these people, so meaning having not gone to visit that country yet, is incredibly rewarding from an emotional perspective. So a lot of richness added into the U.S. mentors' professional lives as they work to provide support and guidance for international trainees and really engage in this concept of cross-cultural mentoring. I'm going to pause for a moment. I'm curious now, just from you, who here is currently on a mentoring team, meaning you are a co-mentor with somebody in the United States or in a different country? Okay, about half and half, yes, no. Good, so this is something we can probably talk more about in a future session as well. Some of you not mentoring yet, so this is going to give you a good opportunity to plan. All right, so a few more minutes to respond, and then I'll share those results back to you. All right, about half and half. As you can see here. Okay. All right, and so now I'd like to stop. This is really going to wrap up our presentation and give us a few minutes for questions and comments. But I would love to hear from you who are in the room, and so many of you who are co-mentoring on teams and mentoring cross-culturally, again, whether it's within your own country or across country. Could you share with me a little bit about the rewards of mentoring, or if you have a particular question about a challenge you've had, please go ahead and put that in the chat now, and I'm going to pause and let you type in some responses. Rewards of mentoring cross-culturally, or any other challenges you've had. Expanding research focus, that is a good one. Thank you for sharing that, Arkita. That's a big one, right? And I think that I've heard that from the US mentors a lot, is that one thing I haven't discussed in this presentation, which is really important, which is resources and access to resources, and that can be complicated and different depending on the countries we're talking about. But I think the US mentors have also expressed just the creativity of their trainees and how they problem solve in different ways in their own countries, and how that a lot of that is really relevant and helpful to how we could think about things differently in the United States. So I do think there's a real mutual learning there between mentors and trainees across different cultures and contents, even when we're working from a high-income country to a low or middle-income country. What other rewards have you experienced as mentors, either in cross-cultural mentoring or mentoring in teams? Hopefully that you've experienced some rewards. Anybody else? Thank you, Sarita. Yeah, that's great. Learning. I do think there's a lot of learning to be done by co-mentors. And I think that would be a really interesting area to strengthen and build and probably evaluate how we really could build more relationships and collaborations. Because as you know, because I know a little bit about your own program, Sarita, and your own work, but also for other people on the call, that, you know, we in the United States do have, in some cases, incentive to mentor because we can write about it in our annual reviews. We write about it it's considered as part of our promotion process. But I think it's important for us to think through what the incentive is for people who are our co-mentors and how we can contribute to making it a beneficial experience for their own careers. And when we talk to mentors in the Fogarty programs that are outside of the United States, that's one thing they say is, if I'm taking time to do this mentoring, how do I balance that with the time I need to advance my own career so I ensure I'm still a good mentor? So I think mentoring teams are an opportunity for us to do that work. Thank you, Russell. Insightful new perspective on tackling major TB problems. Certainly a great reward for mentoring junior scientists. Anybody else? And let me just open it up. That's going to be the summary of our session together today. Do you have any other questions or comments before we wrap up? If not, Laurel, if you don't mind putting the evaluation link in the chat, that would be great. And we're going to ask you to evaluate our time together in this session today. And here it is right here, but we'll put it in the chat for you as well. Actually, I'm going to thank you very much, Laurel. And I also just want to apologize once again for the technical challenges with my slides and with Zoom. I'm sorry about that. Glad we got that back on track, but I apologize for that interruption. If you would click on that link that Laurel just put in the chat so that you can do a quick evaluation and let us know if there's other topics or additional things you would like to see in these sessions as we move forward. And as a reminder, our next session is on September 14th. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about communication and feedback. I'll give some tips on more concrete tips on how to phrase and write feedback so that it's actionable and easy to respond to. And I'll also talk through some steps of how to have difficult conversations when things perhaps are not going as well as you hope or are not on track. And that will be an hour on September 14th. We'll send you out a reminder and we hope we will all see you there. And that's everything for today. So thank you everyone for joining this morning, this afternoon, and this evening. And please do take a minute to fill out the evaluation survey and we hope to see you on September 14th.